Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well-appointed basement with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Welcome to Coast AM, the very best in late-night talk radio. I'm Richard Serrett, and this morning, I'm coming to you live from my home studio in Old Thornhill, just north of Toronto. We're still a little over 2 weeks away from Halloween, but it's never too early to discuss scary movies. My love of vampire films in particular began at the Breezes Drive-In in Brantford, Ontario, back in 1967. In those days, if my mom and dad wanted to go see a movie, they had to take me and my 4 siblings with them. It wasn't always easy finding a babysitter willing to sit for 5 rambunctious kids. So into our 62 Valiant Station wagon, we'd pile. And I remember my mom would spend most of the afternoon popping corn on the stove and filling enormous plastic bags. We were on a bit of a budget those days. And my parents had a large foam pad in the way back of the station wagon, and they covered it with terry cloth. And that's where we slept. And there was something magical about being carried out to the car after dark in my pajamas. And I remember the movie. It was Divorce American Style with Dick Van Dyke and Debbie Reynolds. I don't remember much about it. I was 4 or 5 at the time. I didn't even know what divorce meant. But the movie was for my parents. We younger kids were just expected to drift off to sleep. But before the main feature began, they played a number of trailers for upcoming movie releases, and one of those trailers was for a movie called The Queen of Blood, starring James Saxon, Basil Rathbone, Dennis Hopper, and Florence Marley. And it was set in the distant future of 1990. Basically, a group of astronauts go to Mars and return with a green vampire woman. That was my first vampire movie. And I only saw a 2-minute trailer, but that was it for me. I was terrified, yet I couldn't look away. That was followed a few years later with The Night Stalker and the made-for-TV movie on ABC starring Darren McGavin about a rumpled and abrasive newspaper reporter chasing down a vampire who's on the prowl in Las Vegas. So I am really looking forward to my conversation in hours 1 and 2 tonight with filmmaker, television writer, producer, podcaster, Christopher Garetano. Chris is also a film historian, and when it comes to horror classics, he knows where the bodies are buried, figuratively and literally. He's just published South Texas Blues, which is based on the true story of legendary director Toby Hooper, the brilliant madman director of the 1974 classic horror film The Texas Chain Saw Massacre, about a family of crazy killers, unemployed slaughterhouse workers, starring Gunnar Hansen as Leatherface. We'll find out why this movie is so near and dear to Chris. Counting down some of the greatest horror films of all time, coming up in hours 1 and 2. In the second half of our pre-Halloween version of Coast, Brandon Scheck-Snyder hosts the chart-topping history podcast Southern Gothic, a show that explores the dark history of the American South and sheds light on some of its most infamous legends, mysteries, true crime, and yes, of course, haunted places. Haunted history of the South, from battlefields to plantations, the Louisiana swamps to Appalachia. How ghost stories and folklore evolve over time into well-known myths and legends. And yes, he'll share a ghost story or 5. Behind the scenes of some of your favorite horror films with Chris Garetano. That's next. Welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler, hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather round the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. I'm Richard Serrett, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Why don't you stay a while? Christopher Garetano was born in New York and is a graduate of the School of Visual Arts with a BFA in film. He is the creator and director of the award-winning docudrama Montauk Chronicles. He's the co-creator, executive producer, and co-host of the History Channel's The Dark Files. In 2019, Christopher created, executive produced, and hosted his 8-episode investigative series Strange World for the Travel Discovery Channel networks. He's developing several new TV programs and films and writing a book of short horror science fiction stories, filming his independent science fiction motion picture In Ink by Andromeda the Great. His podcast, Off to the Witch, debuted in the fall of 2020, and he has just published South Texas Blues, soon to be a motion picture with a foreword by our mutual friend, Chris Alexander. Christopher Garetano, welcome back to Coast. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
South Texas Blues. Is this a screenplay or a novel?
So, it's a screenplay. And the thing is, I when I was in film school in the 90s, walking around New York City, I devoured screenplays and stage plays. And I had no issues holding it up against the best literature. And I was reading Tennessee Williams, and I was reading screenplays by Robert Towne, and incredible scripts, like Paul Schrader's screenplay for Taxi Driver. So to me, it was interpreting it just like a novel, and South Texas Blues has been in my life for so long, 20 years, revising it over the years, that I wanted to, before it becomes this thing and becomes absorbed into a larger system, it's going to end up being like a 6-hour movie, and I wrote a 3-hour movie at best. I wanted that original script to be available to people to read and interpret as they would a novel.
So is this sort of your imagining, recreating some conversations that the director Toby Hooper maybe had with, some of the cast and the crew in making Texas Chain Saw Massacre?
It's some of it. I know there was I don't want to say it's completely similar, but there was a similar approach to a book that was written about John Belushi, assuming how Belushi would be interpreting things, looking back at his life after his death. And I think this is more like that. I assume Toby Hooper as the anti-hero of the story. And yes, it all comes from fact. And I did an extensive amount of research. I talked to just about everybody involved. But I had to write a story, and I dramatized it and stylized it as a story. So it's not a documentary, but it has a lot of factual events within. I tried to make just about everything I was writing factual, but there are these fantasy moments because Toby was under great duress while he was making that movie, and I needed to translate that into what a 30-year-old undiscovered, because he wasn't famous back then. He was making one of the greatest horror films ever made and had no idea what was going to happen with it. Not to give away the ending, but it doesn't end at a big film festival. It ends with him alone. And that's what this is about. It's creating something that's going to influence film history, people's imaginations. 50 years later, there are people all around the world watching that movie right now. He had no idea. Nobody on set had any idea that was going to happen.
No, I get the impression that nobody believed in him, not even the cast or the crew while they were making the movie.
No, they didn't. Many people thought at best, and Gunnar Hansen himself even told me, he said, no, he's like, I thought at best maybe it would reach a few drive-ins. And, Robert Burns, the great special effects artist, production designer, nobody thought it was going anywhere. But I do believe Toby Hooper did, because that movie's consistent. There's a movie maker behind that movie. Some movies are just pure chaos. I can pick films that were made, European films that have moments of brilliant horror films, right? Some of Lucio Fulci's. He was obsessed with those movies, but later on he just had to follow his model. And in this case, this was a guy who wasn't making horror films before this. He came into this much like William Friedkin did with The Exorcist. It was a fresh, strong, documentary-like approach, and the movie was consistent from beginning to end, even in its performances.
I remember an interview with Gunnar Hansen talking about how, I mean, he wasn't the first choice. In fact, I think filming had started, but they couldn't get the lead to come out of I guess he was in a mood or he was drunk or something. And they couldn't get him to come out of the motel. So then they brought in Gunnar Hansen. And Gunnar Hansen, the moment he walked in the room, Toby Hooper had decided, I want you to play the film because you fill the door. Like he was a large man. He needed that physicality. Is that what are your thoughts on that?
That's 100% true, and that's all in South Texas Blues. And also, because the gentleman that they had before was emotionally distraught and somewhat violent and couldn't get him, he was drunk and they couldn't get him out of a hotel room, they came up with a list of questions because they didn't want a maniac playing their maniac. And Gunnar Hansen was, he was an intellectual. He was calm and polite and a decent guy, and he ended up playing this intense role. And that movie, if you look at the horror films we'll talk about tonight, there's something consistent amongst all of them, several different things in terms of their making, the chaos behind the scenes that lent to what we saw ultimately. If you compare to a lot of horror films today, they're manufactured in a boardroom, and you just can't get that charm and that strength and power that you get out of these films. And even the auteurs, the directors with the visions and the passion that were behind these movies, they're different in some of these modern films. There's some great modern horror films and a lot of independent films, and I think because of the mother of invention, independent horror films will always be the greatest, or an independent filmmaker working with a studio, battling with the studio for their vision, will end up making a great horror film. I do not believe there was ever a great horror movie made by committee, not one.
So Gunnar Hansen, Leatherface, of course. I mean, he doesn't speak. You can't see his face. That takes a special kind of talent as an actor to be able to pull that role off if you can't use your voice and you can't use your face.
Well, think about, and I know you lived through that era, and it's the actors of the day. It's just around the end of the Vietnam War. Every actor out there is intending to be intense and dark and powerful and have something to say, and all the directors of the day as well were like that. So that was the zeitgeist. And so Gunnar Hansen in this little drive-in horror movie that they're making in Austin, Texas, that wasn't expected to go anywhere, is preparing like a serious actor. Marilyn Burns in that movie, okay, she's the survivor at the end. She played Sally. She was intense. She was amazing in that film. I suspect if a motion picture like that came out today, there are possibilities that they would win Academy Awards, but for a very long time, that movie was taboo. It was drive-in, violent, even though there wasn't much on-screen violence, it was very suggested. But it was banned in England. It was a video nasty, it wasn't like it is today, where now this word, I hate using this word about these movies because the origins were fantastic, the origin films, but franchises, you could buy Leatherface action figures at Walmart, It's like you never expect that when you saw that movie back then.
So it's called the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, but if memory serves, there's only one person who's actually killed with a chainsaw. Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, no, I would say two, at least two. Okay, so there's William Vale's character. Mind you, he's not killed with a chainsaw, but he's and there are people chased with chainsaws. You might be right about that. So Paul Partain is murdered with a chainsaw on a little bit off screen. Okay, and it's obscured. His back is turned to us, and Sally is screaming. But I believe there's an off-screen dismemberment by a chainsaw in another scene, if you remember that scene. After the gentleman's hit in the head by a sledgehammer, he's brought into the room. And all of this stuff is suggested. It's so gruesome because it's off-screen. You're not really seeing it. The sequel was very gory, and it was a satire. But this movie there was something about it, no? I mean, it felt real.
Talk to me about the dialogue in the film also that felt very real and genuine. We often think of, well, Leatherface doesn't speak, but we think of the monsters, the classic monsters, and so forth. I mean, was this the first horror movie where the monster wasn't actually, you know, the undead or, you know, or a Frankenstein monster? It was an actual, you know, crazed individual.
Well, I mean, Psycho, some years previous, and then
True.
the Herschel Gordon, and Psycho based on the same real life monster, Ed Gein. It was also the Texas Chain Saw Massacre was based on him as well. And, you know, you had those schlocky Herschel Gordon Lewis movies that were made some years previous about murderers, and it was very, very gory. But I think this was the first of its kind, 100%, that achieved across the board the atmosphere that it did, and this flow of dialogue that you were just mentioning. Now, later on, Ridley Scott made Alien. You could see, and he said that he was inspired by the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. He wanted to make that in space, but not only inspired by the power of the movie, because Alien was terrifying when it came out, but there was also a documentary-like quality at times to Alien. And if you look at how the dialogue is in Alien, it's very natural. Just like the Texas Chain Saw Massacre, the interaction between the space truckers there's a very natural flow. I think that begins with the written page, and then you allow those actors to improv from take to take, and then what you see at the end of the day is a combination of several different takes coming together as the illusion that they're one fluid take.
The character Leatherface, is that, well, it's based, as you say, on Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield, which was turned into a musical of all things, and we talked about that on Coast a couple of weeks ago. But are there other elements in Leatherface that are based on anyone that Toby Hooper knew, or is it a composite, or is it Ed Gein pretty much?
Oh, I believe it's a total composite. You know, according to Hooper, he said that it was also based on the Bloody Bender family, and that was. What was that, Tennessee? Yeah, I think, or was it Kansas? But there were other murderers like that, and I'm sure EC Comics lent to it, and a whole bunch of other things. You know, even though they're not pure imitations, I always saw this as this was a man who grew up with movies like Invaders from Mars and the Universal horror films and the Hammer horror films, and so there is a bit of a Gothic feel to it at times, just brought into this new vision. It was very new. It was a very fresh vision of something, because mind you, erase all the films that were made after 73. He wasn't influenced by those movies. He was influenced by the movies previous, and so this was a fresh take on things, and he was a serious filmmaker. Even though this was meant to make money, he was still approaching it with that strength and vision, and so I'm sure there were a variety. Now, there's arguments about what influenced it, because Toby had a lot of different stories and ideas that he came up with through the years that he said. I know I was in a department store, and this is how South Texas Blues opens up. Toby said he was in a department store, and it was around the holiday season, and it was crowded, and he felt claustrophobic, and in the distance he saw in the hardware department a setup of chainsaws, and immediately he said, "This is how I'm going to get out of here." Now, only a maniac would think that, but he would saw his way out. He said, "Well, that was the beginning of it, you know."
The actual shooting of the film has been described as excruciating. We're going to head into a break here in a moment, and we'll continue to talk about it after the break. But let's just begin the conversation now, because Toby Hooper wasn't afraid to push his actors. So talk to me about why this was so excruciating to make this film.
Well, for a lot of reasons. Safety wasn't first on this set, and there were everything that you could think to go wrong. Let's say, for instance, Marilyn Burns running at night through a thicket of mesquite trees, which have these horrible thorns with barbs in them that actually, once punctured in the skin, they have to be surgically removed, and that's exactly what happened to her. So they had her running through those thorns all night, and they had to bring her to a doctor to surgically remove mesquite thorns out of her leg.
Oh,
That's just
my.
one of the many things that happen.
All right, well, Chris, we'll take a time out. We'll come back and we'll get into some of the other behind-the-scenes stories, the making of the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. Christopher Garetano is here on Coast to Coast AM. Say hello on Twitter at Richard Serrett, S-Y, because I love you, R-E-T-T. In September 2016, NASA launched the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft on a mission to study the asteroid Bennu, a potentially hazardous celestial body. After spending over 2 years investigating and collecting samples from Bennu, the spacecraft recently returned to Earth. An initial analysis of the samples has revealed promising results, with the presence of water and significant amounts of carbon, suggesting the potential existence of life's building blocks on the asteroid. This finding aligns with the long-standing hypothesis that asteroids and comets could have delivered essential materials for life's development on Earth in the distant past. You can read more of the story. That's in the highlight carousel up at coasttocoastam.com. Back to more of my conversation with Christopher Garetano as we count down some of the top horror films of all time, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Christopher Garetano is with us, award-winning filmmaker, writer, producer, director, and he has just published South Texas Blues, soon to be a motion picture. And we're talking about the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. We were talking about what a difficult shoot it was, punishing. And you were mentioning Marilyn Burns, who plays Sally Hardesty, and she's made to run through this thick brush, and she's being punctured by thorns, and they have to be surgically removed. And yet that's not all of it. I mean, there were other sort of very harrowing incidents. Tell me more.
Okay, so makeup artist Dottie Pearl. Okay, so now there was a shoot that lasted almost 36 hours in that farmhouse because there was no ventilation, there was no air conditioning, and it was the dead heat of summer, Texas summer, okay? And so it's getting really hot in there, and they have these meats sitting around on the table. They also had dead animals that they gathered from a vet who was disposing of bodies and bones, and so Bob Burns brought all that stuff to the set. All this stuff is starting to decay and decompose. And so the bright idea they came up with is to inject formaldehyde into everything. So Dottie Pearl is injecting formaldehyde into the meat, into the dead animals that they had strung all over the place. So she has this dead dog in her lap, and she ended up puncturing through the dog into her leg.
Oh, dear Lord.
Of formaldehyde, yeah. And she freaked out, and that's all in the story as well. And that's not even the beginning. There's so much more that happened on this set. But if you think about it, if the brilliance of this movie is that, now there's chaos on just about every film set. However, this somehow was wrangled brilliantly and permeated into the movie, especially the madness of the last, I'd say, 15, 20 minutes of the movie. I mean, it's assumed as it's quasi-real, okay, because these people are really experiencing something. And I would say the most torture that you can put a series of actors through simultaneously was that 36-hour shoot straight they were shooting. This is after everyone's already exhausted. If anyone and everyone knows this dinner scene at the end where it was just absolute chaos and madness. Okay, so you have all these rotting meats all over the table, and you have a group of people in a house with extreme temperatures. For instance, Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface, was not able to change his wardrobe. So his body odor was something that was intense. You had decaying and rotting animals, decaying and rotting meat, and everyone packed into a little room with hot lights, okay, which they used to shoot film with, making it even hotter inside. There was a funeral pyre of animal bodies and bones burning outside with all of that smoke coming in, and madness happening around that table, which you can see in that movie. All of those actors are being affected by what was really going on inside, and that however they hung in there and didn't quit is what you're really seeing on screen. The result was because of what was happening on set, and somehow they kept it together enough to shoot it.
Wow, that's a remarkable story. I'm glad I wasn't on the set to witness that. Here's something I didn't know. The narrator in the opening sequence is played by a very young John Larroquette.
That is John Larroquette, and he came back for the Michael Bay produced remake in the early 2000s to narrate the opening, which wasn't even a fraction as good as the original.
They never are. They never are.
Not a chance. No. Well, in some cases.
Yeah. What would it be? A sequel which lived up to the original? What, Aliens?
I love Aliens. I think Alien and Aliens are two completely different movies. Alien is a horror film. Aliens is a wonderfully made action movie, in my opinion. But if we were to talk remakes, there are two that come to mind that are fantastic, one of which is John Carpenter's The Thing with Kurt Russell, and the other is David Cronenberg's The Fly. But again, some people argue that the original is better. I mean, I could talk to my mother, and she loves Howard Hawks' The Thing better than the one with that made by John Carpenter. And that movie, as much as it's praised these days as a masterpiece, and it is a masterpiece, absolute masterpiece, was trashed, almost killed Carpenter's career back then. And a lot of people forget. Yeah.
See,
it didn't do well at the box office. However you want to get into this. I don't know if you want to still talk about Chainsaw.
No, we've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's talk about The Thing, because I was going to say, it's been quite a while since I saw the original Thing, and I don't know, I found it kind of campy. James Arness, I thought he looked like a giant carrot. I don't know, it didn't have the impact on me that the remake did, the Carpenter version.
Right. Now, if I suppose if that really hit you in your formative years, you're hanging on to something and you're ignoring any issues with it now, how it's dated, whatever. I mean, that happens with me too. I'm nostalgic about certain things that I forgive. That maybe some youth might see today and not like. This is ridiculous. I mean, I remember being in a theater with a revival of The Exorcist, and there were some kids behind me talking and giggling and laughing, and I'm like, wow, that must have been the polar opposite of what happened in the early 70s when it came out,
Yeah. We'll come around and talk about The Exorcist again, but
sure.
I hadn't realized that Carpenter's The Thing was panned.
Oh yeah, he almost lost his career over that. So he had made Halloween, and it was a big hit, made a lot of money, and independent film, but Universal ended up distributing it, and so he gets The Thing, and he kills himself to make this movie. And Rob Bottin, a very young special effects artist, protege of Rick Baker and Dick Smith, completely evolves on the set, and those special effects, in my opinion, have not been matched since. Okay?
Yeah, they're great.
That movie's amazing. All across the board, fantastic performances, beautiful photography, direction, blocking, everything, and it's suspenseful and powerful. And it comes out the same summer that E.T. comes out, and everybody wants a friendly, loving alien, and now you have this grisly, violent, dark, abysmal perspective, even on human survival. It's going to be a bad thing, and no pun intended. And so, critics were just slamming this thing, and I think a lot of people didn't really. I mean, I saw it as a little kid, and I was terrified, and I'm sure a lot of us saw it, just like Blade Runner. Blade Runner bombed at the box office, around the same time too, and so it's like, later on, these things become classics. People grow up that loved it when they were kids, or people that remembered it and were blown away in the first place, or other people revisit it. And, and now it has another life. It's forever. But back then, it's, Carpenter, he was supposed to direct another film after that he had on his plate, and it was taken away from him because of his failure on The Thing. And I believe the movie was Firestarter. It was an adaptation of Stephen King's Firestarter. And so that was next in line. And he had that taken away from him. And to redeem himself, he made Starman. And
oh, yes.
it was a little more family-friendly alien movie.
Great
Great movie.
Jeff Bridges? Was it Jeff Bridges?
Right. Bridges was nominated for an Academy Award for that film. But The Thing, I mean, imagine, just killing yourself to make a motion picture and knowing what you made, and it gets completely slammed and is not fully respected until years later. And the same thing happened to Friedkin with the movie Sorcerer that he made after The Exorcist. Judge, Jury, and Executioner are those reviews.
Yeah. Wasn't Toby Hooper supposed to direct The Thing?
I don't know. There were many directors. I know that it was set up years previous in the 70s and didn't finally come to its fruition until Carpenter directed it. But he may have been one of the choices, just like Hooper was in line to direct Return of the Living Dead and many other movies. George Romero was supposed to direct The Stand way back then. These guys, the movies that could have been. But I think whether it be scheduling or arguing in a boardroom or negotiations for prices, things didn't work out.
And you were talking about the special effects, which were remarkable. Still to this day, over 40 years later, still stomach churning. The special effects, was it Rob Bottin? He was just a kid. He was like 22 or something. What a talent.
Yeah, and he has kind of disappeared. One of the last things that I know he worked on was Fight Club, and that was in the 90s. So I don't know what he really did after that. May have worked on a couple of things, but what a brilliant special effects artist. Everything from The Howling to The Thing to RoboCop, to Legend, Ridley Scott's Legend. These are some of the greatest special effects makeup creations in movie history. And again, simultaneously with John Carpenter, Rob Bottin makes these incredible, these creations that just blow your mind. You've never seen anything like it. I can't imagine. Even it inspired a lot of Japanese anime. Think about like the shape-shifting gore of creatures coming out of people and stuff. I don't recall any movie that ever portrayed that until John Carpenter's The Thing in that way, especially with live special effects that were so innovative that you must understand as an audience that those gags are not just created by the makeup effects artist. That is a dance between the director, the makeup effects artist, the editor, and the production designer. And all of those things coming together, lighting technicians are creating the illusion of that stuff happening. There was a lot of reverse photography, but it was all real. There was a lot of stop-motion animation in the end, too. Not claymation, but, stop-motion animation, armature-type puppets in some of those scenes. But a lot of that was on-set magic. And, very little of that. When they made the Thing prequel years later, they decided to use computer-generated graphics. And in some cases, that stuff is great, but not in that case.
Any sort of behind-the-scenes mishaps during the making of that movie?
In terms of The Thing?
Yeah.
They're shooting between Canada and Alaska, and they are, shooting in freezing cold conditions, and, then they shot in a different location for the sets, just like The Exorcist. All those interior locations were shot in New York. But in terms of people getting hurt, I think Carpenter was a little more responsible. However, I think one of the casualties was Rob Bottin getting very sick, pushing himself to work. And he said he almost died while he was making it. And there were real explosions on set, and real hardships making these things, which I think a lot of these days people aren't really put through that. And I'm not condoning anybody in danger, but I believe there should be a heightened effort put into things. However, keeping everyone safe as possible. You know, John Landis, who made a great horror film, one of my favorite of all time, American Werewolf in London, later went on to Twilight Zone, the movie, and unfortunately, because of his lust for vision, some people were in danger. And during if you remember the segment of the Twilight Zone, the movie with Vic Morrow,
yes,
where he was a racist, he was a bigot, and he was forced to be put in the shoes of people who had experienced an extreme amount of racism. He was in Vietnam. And so these sequences led to the death of the actor Vic Morrow and two little children because Landis wanted this spectacular, explosive ending to this chapter. And I'm sure the footage was amazing. Unfortunately, the bombs that were being used in pyrotechnics went off way too high, affected a helicopter that was flying over, and that copter came down and killed 3 people. And that's the kind of thing that has destroyed a daring set. But on independent sets, even to this day, I think people are still put in a similar amount of danger.
It's called a remake, but is it really? It's not exactly a remake of the 51 version, is it? Or is it more of a, I don't know, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as more of an adaptation of John Campbell's Who Goes There novel. And, you know, Carpenter went back to the source material and made this Lovecraftian horror film out of it. And it's not, you know, I'm sure there are moments that are certainly echoes of some brilliant moments in the Howard Hawks picture. But outside of that, it was very much his own picture, and it was one of the greatest remakes ever. And, you know, later on now, you know, to this day, it's respected as one of the greatest remakes ever made. And I don't think that'll ever change. I have not seen anyone top that movie, no matter what anyone says.
When we come back after the top of the hour, we'll talk about The Exorcist. Chris Garetano is with us. The brand new book, South Texas Blues, soon to be a motion picture, right here on Coast to Coast AM.